Kansas, spring of 1942. The wind came slicing across the plains like a blade sharpened on cold sky. It dragged dust over the ribs of a forgotten machine, a tractor left to rot behind a collapsing barn. Its engine was long dead, its wheels half sunk in prairie grass. The whole thing looked like a relic of another century, a ghost of work left unfinished. Beside it stood a man, Samuel Mallister, 42 years old, farmer, husband, father, and though he didn't know it yet, soldier. His hands were rough enough to sand wood. His face, carved by wind and years, carried the calm stubbornness of a man who had learned to lose and still keep going. He tied a rope around a heap of rusted metal, plow blades, gearboxes, broken tools. To anyone else, it was junk. To Sam, it was ammunition. He was too old for the draft, too young to be useless. And in that gap between the front line and the farm line, he found his own battlefield. After Pearl Harbor, the nation had caught fire. Boys barely out of school lined up to enlist. Factories in Detroit and Pittsburgh roared to life, forging planes, shells, tanks. Every poster shouted, "Do your part." But out here, on the far side of nowhere, there were no tanks to build, no rifles to carry, just silence, and a rising sense that if you weren't doing something, you were already losing. That silence chewed at Sam like guilt. He'd served once before, at 18, near the tail end of the First World War, too late to fight, just in time to come home with the feeling that he hadn't earned the right to call himself a veteran. He'd watched his friends return broken, one-armed, hollow-eyed, coughing up the mud of France. When the world burned again in 1941, he promised himself he'd never sit idle while others carried the weight. But what can one farmer do against a war swallowing continents? The answer came over the radio, wrapped in static and urgency. America needs scrap, salvage for victory. It sounded absurd at first. Scrap metal, bed frames and bicycle chains to fight Hitler? But the government was serious. The War Production Board calculated that to keep the military running through 1942, the country needed more than 6 million tons of scrap, and they were 2 million short. Steel was the blood of the war machine, and America was running anemic. Factories that once made cars now churned out Sherman tanks. Assembly lines for washing machines were repurposed to build bombers. Everything required metal, not just the glamorous stuff like airplanes, but the ordinary, invisible bones of war. Helmets, shell casings, ration tins, tent poles, even mess kits. The government called it the scrap drive. Sam called it his mission. He started small, a rusted gatepost, a bent water pump, the skeletal frame of a windmill that hadn't turned in years. Every day after chores, he'd wander the fields with a notebook and a pencil stub, listing every forgotten hunk of iron half buried under Kansas soil. He'd pry, pull, and dig them free, stacking them behind the barn until the pile stood taller than his son. Neighbors laughed. "That junk won't stop Hitler," one said at the diner, coffee steaming between his smirking lips. But Sam didn't flinch. "Maybe not," he replied, "but it'll help stop rust." He meant it literally. Rust was waste, and in wartime, waste was treason. By mid-April, Sam had hauled nearly 5 tons of scrap out of his own land. Old harrow teeth, plowshares, fence wire, broken chains, anything that would melt. He scrawled the weight in his ledger each night, grease smudged across the page. His wife, Martha, watched him from the porch, worry pinched in her brow. "You sure about this?" she asked one evening. "We might need that metal come harvest." Sam wiped sweat from his temple, eyes on the horizon. "We'll find a way," he said, "but the boys over there need it more." That night, lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind whistle through the eaves. Somewhere across an ocean, men were dying inside, machines made of steel. He pictured them crouched in foxholes, armor gleaming under foreign rain, and thought someone has to feed that fire. The next morning, he borrowed a flatbed trailer and kept loading. Day by day, the pile grew a mountain of memory and rust. The sound of metal striking metal became the rhythm of his spring. By May, Posters began to appear in town halls and schools. Every pound counts. Boy Scouts collected tin cans. Housewives emptied their basements. Even children stripped the lead from toothpaste tubes. But here in Marshall County, no one worked harder than Sam Mallister. The county agent, a tired man in a wrinkled suit, stopped by one afternoon to record Sam's totals. 10 tons already, he said, blinking at the figures. You planning to clean out the whole state? Sam just grinned. If that's what it takes. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing purpose, the one thing harder to find than money in wartime. Every nail, every bolt, every gear he lifted was a statement. I still matter. By June, Kansas heat baked the plains to dust. The air shimmered. Wheat rippled like gold in the distance, but behind Sam's barn rose a heap of dull orange iron that looked like a hill built by ghosts. People came to see it, some out of curiosity, others out of pity. One boy asked, "Mister, you think they'll really make a tank out of that stuff?" Sam smiled faintly. Maybe. Maybe they'll make 1,000. And in a way, they would. Across the nation, millions were doing the same. Mothers, schoolteachers, mechanics, old men with bad knees. They dismantled broken bicycles, tore down sheds, dug up pipes. In Chicago alone, one scrap drive collected enough metal to build an entire destroyer. By the end of 1942, the country would donate over 24 million tons of scrap, enough to forge 100,000 tanks or 25,000 warships. But in early 42, those numbers were just dreams. Out here, all Sam had was rust, sweat, and faith. There was something sacred about the work. Each clang of metal was a prayer, not for victory, but for usefulness. When he tightened the ropes around the trailer, the fibers bit into his hands, leaving lines red as battle scars. The smell of oil and iron filled the air. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't heroic, but it was real. Sometimes, at dusk, Sam would stand at the edge of his field and watch the sunset burn through the dust. The sky turned the color of molten steel. He imagined furnaces roaring in Detroit, sparks flying, men in helmets guiding liquid fire into molds, the same fire he was feeding, one bolt at a time. To most people, war was an ocean away. To Sam, it was right there in the barnyard, in the clatter of chains and the ache of his back. When the county organized its official scrap day, Sam's pile became the centerpiece. Trucks from neighboring farms rolled in, their beds filled with twisted iron and brass. Children waved flags. The local newspaper sent a photographer. The headline read, "Marshall County answers the call." The camera caught Sam mid-stride, sweat shining on his forehead, rope slung over one shoulder. He looked like a man carrying the weight of something invisible. Later that night, Martha clipped the article and pinned it above the kitchen sink. She didn't say anything, but when Sam saw it, he smiled, small, tired, proud. Still, the laughter didn't stop. At the grain store, men teased, "Heard you're building your own tank out there, Sam." He'd nod. "Maybe I am." They didn't see the bigger picture. They couldn't feel the pulse of history the way he did, the sense that every scrap of metal was a heartbeat in the body of a nation awakening. By midsummer, the government declared the scrap drives a moral necessity. President Roosevelt himself addressed the country. "The iron in your backyard may well bring victory to our boys abroad." That sentence hit Sam like gospel. The next morning, he doubled his efforts. The Mallister farm transformed into something between a scrapyard and a cathedral. David, his 16-year-old son, helped drag old axles and dismantle windmill blades. The clangs echoed across the fields, a metallic hymn to persistence. One afternoon, Martha brought them lemonade and paused, watching her husband and son wrestling with a rusted water tank. The sun caught the dust in the air, turning it silver. For a moment, it looked like they were forging light itself. "Maybe," she whispered to herself, "maybe this really does matter." And it did. The Marshall County drive that summer exceeded its quota by 300%. Sam's pile alone accounted for nearly a third. The local official sent a letter of commendation, stamped with the seal of the War Production Board. Sam folded it once and tucked it into his ledger, the same place he kept the list of weights and dates. Proof, not of pride, but of purpose. But numbers don't tell stories. They can't measure what it feels like to watch a wagon full of scrap disappear down a dirt road, knowing it's headed somewhere you'll never see. They can't capture the moment when a man who thought his days of service were behind him realizes he's serving again. Sometimes, late at night, Sam would sit on the porch steps, lantern light flickering, and listen to the trains groaning across the plains. He liked to imagine one of them carrying his metal eastward, toward Detroit, toward transformation. He didn't need medals or parades. He just needed to know that when the world called, he answered. Because that's what this war demanded, not just soldiers with rifles, but citizens with conviction. Historians would later say, America fought 2 wars, one overseas against fascism and one at home against time. The second was won not in battlefields, but in barns, kitchens, and backyards. In places like Blue Rapids, Kansas, in the sweat of people like Samuel Mallister. And though he didn't know it then, one of those scraps, maybe the blade from his father's plow, maybe the iron frame of his childhood bed, would one day stop a German shell cold. But for now, in the black and white silence of 1942, all that existed was the sound of a man at work. Metal clanging, wind crying through empty fields. A farmer turning rust into resolve. A nation learning that victory could begin with the simplest of acts, the lift of a hand, the tightening of a rope, the faith that even forgotten things could still be forged into something that lasts. By the summer of 1942, the wind over Kansas carried more than dust. It carried the sound of a nation shifting gears. Across the plains, radios hummed with a single phrase, "Salvage for victory." Every county agent, every preacher, every schoolteacher repeated it like a hymn. The message was simple, brutal, and clear. America was running out of metal. Steel wasn't just steel anymore. It was time, power, survival. The factories of Detroit were starving for raw material. Tanks, ships, planes, they all demanded iron, like a living thing demands blood. To build one Sherman tank, the army needed 18 tons of steel. To win a war, they'd need thousands. And where would that steel come from? Not from mines, not fast enough. It would come from the people. So the government turned the country into a foundry without walls. Farmyards became supply lines. Attics became stockpiles. Every nail, every pipe, every bent piece of wire was suddenly part of the war effort. What was once junk now carried moral weight. In Marshall County, Kansas, that call met a man already in motion. Samuel Mallister didn't wait for orders. He'd been answering them before anyone asked. By June, his scrap pile had become a landmark, a strange monument of rust and resolve. Neighbors driving past slowed their trucks just to look. Some nodded with quiet respect. Others shook their heads. "Sam's gone scrap crazy," they said. "He'll give away the roof next." Maybe he would have. Because Sam wasn't chasing recognition, he was chasing redemption. Too old to fight, too proud to do nothing, this was how he served. Word of his dedication spread fast. A reporter from the Blue Rapids Sentinel showed up one afternoon, camera slung over his shoulder. He found Sam knee-deep in iron, sleeves rolled, face streaked with dust. When the flash went off, the farmer barely looked up. He was busy wrestling an axle out of the mud. The article ran a week later. One man's rust, Marshall County's pride. Beneath it, a photograph of Sam, beside his mountain of scrap. The caption read, "Every pound counts." That headline lit a fuse. Other farmers began clearing their barns, dragging out forgotten machinery, piling it by the roadside. Schools announced competitions. Churches collected offering plates full of nails and bolts. In Topeka, the governor declared August Scrap Month for the entire state. By July, Kansas had become a patchwork of determination, a living machine fueled by belief. Trucks roared down gravel roads carrying heaps of metal. Children waved flags as they passed, shouting, "For victory!" What had started as a government appeal had become a moral crusade, and Sam, quiet, stubborn Sam, had unknowingly become its symbol. Each morning before sunrise, he hitched the trailer to his old pickup. The engine coughed awake, the same way America had. He'd drive across neighboring farms, checking on the other piles, offering help. He didn't talk much, but people followed his example. Some brought wagon wheels, others bed frames. One man showed up with the twisted skeleton of a Model T. Sam just nodded. "That'll fight," he said. The county depot could barely keep up. Rail cars stood lined along the siding, their open beds filled with iron that glittered faintly under the hot Sunday. Each load weighed several tons, bound for the refineries and mills of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio. When the wind blew across those piles, it sang a dry, metallic rattle that sounded like war drums. But not everyone shared the fervor. There were skeptics, cynics, those who saw the whole thing as theater. At the diner, old farmers argued that the government was exaggerating. "That junk'll never reach the front," one scoffed. "They're just keeping us busy." Sam, sitting at the counter, wiped his hands on a rag and said quietly, "Maybe. But doing nothing never won a war." Silence fell. No one answered. He walked out, leaving the smell of coffee and sawdust behind. Outside, the sky hung low and heavy, the color of iron. By August, the scrap drive became a full-scale movement. In towns across the Midwest, parades marched not for show but for steel. Children pulled wagons filled with tin cans. Boy Scouts collected door to door. Even prisoners in county jails were enlisted to strip abandoned cars for parts. The War Production Board began printing posters showing tanks made of scrap, stamped with slogans, "Your junk can save a life. Rust never sleeps, recycle it for victory." Sam kept a few tacked to the barn wall. He liked their bold simplicity, the clean block letters, and the silent challenge they carried. Martha still worried. She watched the pile grow higher than the roofline and muttered, "You've given away half our tools." Sam just smiled. Tools can be replaced. Boys can't. It wasn't defiance, it was truth, hammered flat by experience. Their son, David, had started taking pride in it too. He'd begun keeping his own notebook, scribbling weights and dates beside his father's. The two of them worked side by side, sweat running down their necks, hauling scrap until the stars came out. When exhaustion hit, Sam would rest on the trailer fender and stare at the horizon, where thunderheads brewed like smoke from distant guns. In those moments, the farm felt both tiny and infinite, one speck in a war that stretched across the world. By late August, Marshall County had collected over 300 tons of metal. The local depot had become a battlefield of industry, cranes swinging, trucks unloading, sparks flying from torches, cutting larger pieces down to size. Men who once plowed wheat now swung hammers. Women wore gloves and carried clipboards. No one talked about politics anymore. They talked about pounds, tons, trains, deadlines. The government sent a telegram congratulating the county for exceeding its quota. It was signed simply, War Production Board, Washington. Sam read it once and folded it into his ledger beside the newspaper clipping. He didn't smile, he just kept working. Because deep down, he knew quotas were numbers, and wars weren't won by numbers alone. They were won by stubbornness, by the refusal to stop when the work turned heavy. Then came the heat wave. August roared in with 100-degree days that baked the ground solid. Metal burned to the touch. Even the cows stood in the shade, ribs showing through. And still, Sam worked. Neighbors offered to help, but he waved them off. "I'm fine," he'd say. "Rust doesn't wait." Sometimes he'd pause to listen to the faraway rumble of trains, imagining his scrap already in motion bound eastward toward Detroit, where molten furnaces waited like open mouths. At night, he lay awake beside Martha, the sound of cicadas filling the dark. "What if none of this makes a difference?" she whispered. He turned toward her, voice steady. "Then we'll know we tried." The next morning, he was back at it before sunrise. By the end of August, something shifted. The drive had reached its peak. All across the Midwest, farmers were stripping their fields bare of anything metal. Barns looked gutted, fences patched with wood where wire had been donated. Even mailboxes vanished, repurposed into bullet casings and armor plate. The effort was staggering. Nationwide, Americans had already collected over 15 million tons of scrap, half of it from rural counties like Sam's. It was more than the government had dared to hope. A quiet miracle of collective will. In Washington, analysts noticed the numbers and smiled. In Berlin, German intelligence noticed too and stopped laughing. Nazi propaganda had mocked the American scrap drives as childish. But by late '42, their own war machine was starving for resources, while American factories flooded the world with weapons. Democracy, it turned out, could outproduce dictatorship. Meanwhile, in Kansas, Sam's world shrank back to the size of his farm. His pile was almost gone, loaded onto trains, melted into something greater. The barnyard felt empty without it. For the first time in months, there was space where the mountain had stood. Martha planted flowers there. David built a small wooden crate and filled it with the few pieces that hadn't been taken, keepsakes of a fight, fought without bullets. That evening, Sam sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the wheat. The light caught the edge of an old horseshoe lying in the dirt. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The metal felt cool, heavy, alive. He didn't know where his scrap would end up. Detroit, maybe. Pittsburgh. He didn't care. What mattered was that it was out there now, part of something vast and necessary. The air was thick with the smell of rain. Thunder grumbled low on the horizon, the first sign of the coming storm. Sam leaned back, boots creaking on the porch rail. He didn't know that within a week, lightning would strike the windbreak behind the barn. He didn't know that the pile he'd rebuilt with his bare hands would be scattered across the fields like shrapnel. For now, there was peace. For now, the wind had gone quiet. And in that silence, under a sky the color of forged steel, a man who never went to war sat with the calm certainty that he had joined it all the same. The country was fighting two wars, one across oceans, one across its own conscience, and both were fed by people like him. The next chapter of his life, like the next storm rolling over the plains, was already on the move. Late August 1942. The air above Marshall County felt like a furnace with no mercy. Heat shimmered over the wheat stubble, the ground baked into plates of cracked clay. Even the wind had grown lazy, carrying only dust and the faint metallic smell of rain that refused to fall. For weeks, Sam Mallister had worked beneath that pitiless sky, 10-12 hours a day. He moved like a man on a mission, his muscles hardened, his shirt permanently stained with rust and sweat. The pile behind his barn now towered over him, a crooked monument of twisted plows, mangled water pumps, iron wagon wheels, and fence posts. When the sun hit it right, the heap glowed dull silver, like a mountain made of ghosts. The county had celebrated him. Newspapers called him the Rust Farmer. Children waved when he drove through town. Even the skeptical men at the diner nodded now. But Sam didn't crave applause. The moment he looked at that pile, he thought not of pride, but of purpose. It wasn't just junk anymore. It was promised steel, waiting to be reborn. Martha watched him from the porch, fanning herself with an old catalogue. "You'll work yourself into the grave," she said. "Then at least it'll be a useful grave," he answered, not looking up. That was Sam Dry, stubborn, unshakably sure. The storm began the way all Kansas storms do, quietly, like a rumor. Morning light broke through thin clouds, sharp as glass. By noon, the horizon had turned the color of gunmetal. A low hum trembled through the earth. Chickens went silent. The air thickened, electric and strange. Martha stepped outside, hand shading her eyes. "Sam," she called, "you'd better come in." But Sam was still in the barn, measuring and recording weights in his ledger. He heard the first crack of thunder, like the sound of a hammer hitting steel. Then came another. The wind picked up, slamming the barn doors against their hinges. He glanced out through a narrow slit, saw the sky boiling black, clouds twisting into a column. And then it hit. Rain didn't fall, it attacked. Sheets of water tore across the plains, wind howling at 60 miles an hour. Lightning ripped the sky apart, white veins crawling from horizon to horizon. Sam grabbed his hat and ran toward the open yard. The pile of scrap, his season's work, shuddered under the assault, the tarp ripping away like paper. "Martha!" he shouted, voice swallowed by the storm. David appeared from the house, sprinting barefoot through mud. "Dad, the windmill!" They turned in time to see it collapse, a slow-motion fall of metal and splinters. Lightning struck the cottonwood behind the barn, splitting it clean in two. The explosion sent a shower of sparks into the air. Sam lunged for the pile, trying to tie down the canvas, but the rope whipped from his hands. The mountain of scrap trembled, shifted, then exploded outward as if some invisible bomb had gone off. Plow blades, pipes, gears, everything he'd spent months gathering went flying across the field. "Martha, inside!" he yelled again. But she was already there, clutching the kitchen doorway, eyes wide with fear. The sky turned to ash. The world went grey and roaring. When it was over an hour later, the silence was worse than the storm. The yard was unrecognizable. The barn roof peeled back like an opened can. The field glittered with metal fragments half buried in mud. The smell of ozone hung in. Sam stood ankle-deep in the wreckage, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his forehead. David came up beside him, panting. "It's ruined," the boy said quietly. Sam stared at the twisted remains, jaw clenched. "No," he said, "it's just heavier now." That single sentence carried the weight of his entire life. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The sun broke through torn clouds, lighting the wreck in cold silver. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed a reminder that the world was still moving forward, storm or not. Then Sam rolled up his sleeves. "Come on, son. We've got work to do." The next days blurred together. From sunrise to moonrise, father and son dragged metal out of the muck. They hauled bent plowshares by hand, scrubbed each piece clean with buckets of well water. The mud dried into dust, then returned to mud again when short bursts of rain followed. Their hands bled, their backs screamed. But they didn't stop. Neighbors passed by, shaking their heads. "Leave it, Sam," one man called. "Ain't worth the trouble." Sam didn't even look up. "It's all worth it." Martha brought them food, saying little. She'd learned not to argue when he was like this, driven, silent, unstoppable. By the fourth day, the pile began to rise again, smaller, cleaner, more deliberate. This time Sam built a platform of wooden beams beneath it to keep it off the ground. He borrowed tarps from 3 different neighbors, stitched them together, and tied them down with wire instead of rope. The storm had taken his work, but left him his will, and that was enough. On the 5th morning, something changed. A wagon creaked down the road and stopped by the gate. It was Mr. Holloway, a farmer from 5 miles east, the same man who'd once called the whole scrap drive a fool's errand. "Got some junk I don't need," Holloway said gruffly. "Figured you'd make better use of it." Sam blinked, too tired to speak. He just nodded. Holloway unloaded a heap of old chains, rusted tools, and the dented hood of a truck. By noon, another wagon arrived. Then, another. Men who had mocked him 2 weeks ago now came offering their own piles of forgotten metal. A blacksmith brought broken anvils. A school janitor donated radiator pipes. The postmaster hauled in the iron base of a desk that had sat in storage since 1918. Before the day ended, Sam's yard looked like a convoy of generosity. He didn't ask for help, but he accepted it. That night, the town of Blue Rapids felt different. The storm had knocked out telephone lines, torn shingles, scattered debris across half the county. Yet the air buzzed with new energy. At the diner, someone raised a toast. To Sam Mallister, the man too stubborn to quit. Laughter followed, warm and genuine. The next morning, the Blue Rapids Sentinel ran another article. Marshall County rallies after the storm, the rust farmer leads again. Underneath, a photograph showed Sam and David lifting a twisted axle together, faces streaked with grime, sunlight breaking through the clouds behind them. That image traveled farther than anyone knew. The Associated Press picked it up, reprinted it in the Kansas City Star, and later, the Chicago Tribune. For the rest of the country, it was just another story from the home front. For Marshall County, it was personal proof that spirit could outlast ruin. By the first week of September, the pile had reached 15 tons bigger than before. The county depot reopened after the storm, and Sam loaded his flatbed trailer one final time. The boards groaned under the weight as he strapped everything down, checking the ropes twice. David climbed into the passenger seat. "You think they'll take it?" "They'll take it," Sam said. "They need it." The drive to town was slow, the truck rattling over washboard roads. Along the way, people waved. A few kids saluted. Sam tipped his hat. At the depot, the foreman, a man named Trask, walked around the load, whistling. "That's a lot of work for a bunch of scrap," he said. Sam wiped his hands on his trousers. "Every ounce counts," he replied, quoting the poster that hung behind Trask's desk. The foreman paused, then nodded. "You're right about that. Pull her in." When the trailer emptied, Sam stood by watching the metal being weighed, tagged, and stacked with the others. His pile joined dozens of others, forming a landscape of rust that stretched to the rail tracks. The sun hit the steel, and for a brief second, the whole depot shone. He felt something then, not pride exactly, but release, the kind a man feels when his purpose meets its end. That evening, he and Martha sat on the porch, watching the sky burn orange over the fields. The wind was calm again. David strummed an old guitar softly. For the first time in months, Sam didn't feel restless. Martha reached for his hand. "You did it," she said. He chuckled. "We did it, and so did half the county." "You think they'll remember?" she asked. He looked toward the horizon, where a faint train whistle carried through the dusk. "They don't need to remember me," he said. "They'll remember what we built." Above them, a single streak of lightning flashed far away, silent and beautiful, like a photograph frozen in time. In the weeks that followed, the scrap from Marshall County joined the river of metal flowing east. Thousands of rail cars loaded with iron, steel, and brass rolled toward the foundries of Detroit. At the Chrysler Tank Arsenal, furnaces blazed 24 hours a day. The same kind of scrap that had once filled Sam's yard was now being melted, purified, pressed, and forged into armor plates and gun mounts. The process was violent: fire, hammer, repetition. Yet out of that violence came precision. Each tank plate carried within it the story of the people who had refused to quit. Sam never saw those factories. He never needed to. He knew where his metal was going. He knew what it meant. And somewhere deep in his bones, he could already hear the echo of Chapter 4, the sound of a train leaving Kansas, bound for Detroit, carrying 15 tons of purpose. The steel that had survived the storm was on its way to war. September 1942. The fields of Kansas were quiet again. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. The storm had passed, the harvest waited, and the last of Sam Mallister's scrap pile was gone, hauled east on a line of freight cars bound for Detroit. For the first time in months, the yard behind the barn stood empty. Only the square patch of flattened grass remained, framed by tire tracks and streaks of dried mud. When the wind shifted, it carried the faintest sound, the low metallic rumble of a train somewhere far away. That was where his work had gone, eastward, into the great belly of America's war machine. Sam didn't need to watch it to know. He could feel it the same way a farmer senses rain before clouds form. The rhythm of the country had changed. The war was no longer over there. It was everywhere, in barns, in kitchens, in the black smoke curling from factory stacks 2,000 miles away. At the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway Yard in Topeka, Kansas, Sam's scrap joined hundreds of others. The yard was a maze of steel railcars, stacked high with iron wheels, axles, and the bones of machines that had once plowed fields or pumped water. Workers moved like ants under the clang of chains and the hiss of brakes. Every load was weighed, recorded, and tagged. Destination: Detroit Tank Arsenal, Warren, Michigan. Consignee: War Production Board, Division of Armor Steel. By mid-September, The trains began to roll east in endless processions. Each car carried roughly 60 tons of scrap metal, old fences, stove parts, tractor gears, nails, pipes, wheels. When the sun struck their sides, they gleamed like rivers of dull silver cutting across the heartland. On those tracks rode the ghosts of America's rural past, the tools of peace melting into the weapons of war. Detroit smelled of smoke, sweat, and molten ambition. It was a city remade overnight. Automobile plants that once built sedans now hammered out tanks and bombers. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler had turned their assembly lines into arteries of steel and fire. The Detroit tank arsenal, built by Chrysler in 1941, had become the beating heart of this transformation. It was the first facility in the United States designed solely to produce tanks, not one or two at a time, but hundreds each month. Its official target, 1 tank per hour. By the time Sam's scrap reached its gates, the arsenal had already built 10,000 Sherman tanks. But demand was growing. The Battle of Stalingrad raged. North Africa waited for reinforcements. The Allies needed armor, and they needed it now. The furnaces never slept. Inside, the world glowed orange. Overhead cranes swung tons of metal through the air. Sparks fell like rain. The heat hit like a wall, thick, living, all-consuming. Workers in leather aprons and goggles fed the furnaces with scrap from across the nation. Farm plows from Kansas, ship parts from Baltimore, rail spikes from Pennsylvania. The roar was deafening. Steel screamed as it melted. Flames chewed through rust and memory until nothing was left but liquid fire. Among the thousands of tons poured that month was a small but unremarkable batch marked Marshall County, Kansas. The inspector noted its contents. Mixed farm scrap, high carbon, some contamination. It didn't matter. The furnaces would clean it. Fire had no bias. The molten metal flowed through trenches into molds, cooling into massive ingots, rectangular blocks of raw steel weighing nearly 10 tons each. Once hardened, they were rolled and pressed into sheets, cut into curves, stamped into shapes. Each piece was measured in thousandths of an inch. Some would become hulls. Some, turret plates. Some, the skeletal frame beneath a driver's seat, unseen, uncelebrated, essential. And among them, though no one could have known, were the remnants of Sam Mallister's farm. The iron bed frame from his youth, the water pump from his father's field, the plow blade that had broken years ago and never been replaced. They were reborn, not in name, but in purpose. In 1942, America's industrial production reached levels the world had never witnessed. Each month, factories delivered 8,000 planes, 20,000 guns, and over 1,000 tanks. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced over 49,000 Sherman tanks, enough to circle the Earth twice, if lined end to end. The secret wasn't just machinery, it was manpower. Men too old for the draft, women too proud to sit idle, teenagers who lied about their age just to work in the plants. They came from farms, schools, and kitchens. They wore gloves and grit and fed the furnaces with belief. In those factory halls, patriotism wasn't a speech. It was a shift that started at 7 a.m. and ended when the whistle blew 12 hours later. Each tank assembled at the arsenal began, as nothing then came to life piece by piece. The process took 48 hours. Ingots rolled into plates, plates welded into hulls, turrets bolted, engines mounted, tracks tested, and every time a worker pressed his hand against a warm steel plate, he felt it vibrate, the faint hum of power, waiting to move. Outside, trains arrived, day and night, dumping more scrap, more raw material, more proof that the home front was winning its war. Engineers joked that America wasn't fighting with bullets but with broom handles, bedposts, and broken gates. They weren't wrong. A reporter touring the plant wrote, "If you want to see democracy in action, don't go to Washington. Go to Detroit. There, every hammer blow is a vote." Meanwhile, back in Kansas, Sam Mallister's life returned to its quiet rhythm. He harvested corn with his son, repaired fences, fed cattle. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, he swore he could hear trains echoing from the east. He'd pause, wipe his brow, and smile faintly. Martha once asked, "Do you ever wonder what became of it, the scrap?" He shook his head. "Don't need to. It's doing what it's meant to do." He didn't know that a part of his windmill would soon roll through Detroit on the turret of a tank marked M4 Sherman, serial 21694. He didn't know that it would sail across the Atlantic, onto the beaches of France, and into the history books. But history knew. By October, the arsenal reached full capacity. It employed over 25,000 workers, many of them women. They called them the Steel Angels. They cut, welded, and assembled machines of war with the precision of surgeons and the stamina of soldiers. The sound inside was relentless metal striking metal, engines roaring on test lines. Every completed tank rolled out under its own power, engines growling like caged thunder. Workers would pause to watch as another Sherman rolled past the gates, its new armor gleaming under soot-gray skies. On one of those days, a supervisor signed off on a batch of armor plate stamped K42M. The K stood for Kansas. The numbers meant nothing to him. To history, they meant everything. The tanks were shipped east by rail to New Jersey, loaded onto Liberty ships, and sent across the Atlantic to England. There, in muddy motor pools and makeshift hangars, crews trained in the art of mechanized warfare. Second Lieutenant Robert Hastings of Des Moines, Iowa, stood beside one such tank. The name painted on its turret, Liberty Rose. He ran his hand over the cold steel, unaware that part of it had once been a Kansas windmill. Within months, he and his crew would drive that same machine down a ramp into the surf at Normandy. And when a German shell struck the front armor days later, that steel forged from Sam's farm, melted in Detroit, hardened in purpose, would hold. But that was still to come. For now, the furnaces kept roaring, the trains kept running, and the heart of America beat to the rhythm of steel on steel. By October, the arsenal reached full capacity. It employed over 25,000 workers, many of them women. They called them the Steel Angels. They cut, welded, and assembled machines of war with the precision of surgeons and the stamina of soldiers. The sound inside was relentless metal striking metal, engines roaring on test lines. Every completed tank rolled out under its own power, engines growling like caged thunder. Workers would pause to watch as another Sherman rolled past the gates, its new armor gleaming under soot-gray skies. On one of those days, a supervisor signed off on a batch of armor plates stamped K42M. The K stood for Kansas. The numbers meant nothing to him. To history, they meant everything. The tanks were shipped east by rail to New Jersey, loaded onto Liberty ships, and sent across the Atlantic to England. There, in muddy motor pools and makeshift hangars, crews trained in the art of mechanized warfare. Second Lieutenant Robert Hastings of Des Moines, Iowa, stood beside one such tank. The name painted on its turret, Liberty Rose. He ran his hand over the cold steel, unaware that part of it had once been a Kansas windmill. Within months, he and his crew would drive that same machine down a ramp into the surf at Normandy. And when a German shell struck the front armor days later, that steel forged from Sam's farm, melted in Detroit, hardened in purpose, would hold. But that was still to come. For now, the furnaces kept roaring, the trains kept running, and the heart of America beat to the rhythm of steel on steel. Back home, winter arrived. Snow settled where the scrap pile used to stand. Martha strung laundry inside because the wind froze it stiff on the line. David studied late into the night, reading engineering manuals borrowed from the school library. One evening, he told his father, "I think I want to study mechanical design. Maybe build tractors one day, or something bigger." Sam nodded slowly. "Then build it strong, build it to last." They didn't talk about the war after that. They didn't need to. It was everywhere in the headlines, the ration books, the empty chairs at church. But also, quietly, in the pride that came from knowing they had done something real, At the Detroit Tank Arsenal, a foreman walked through the plant after midnight, watching the furnaces flare. He stopped at one glowing vat, where fresh molten metal poured into molds. The color was almost holy, pure white at the center, fading to orange at the edges. He turned to a young worker beside him. "Ever wonder where all this stuff comes from?" the man asked. The worker grinned. "From everywhere. Farms, junkyards, garages. America's got more steel than the devil's got lies." The foreman chuckled, but inside he knew the truth. This wasn't just metal. It was belief melted, reforged, and weaponized. By December, shipments from Kansas had blended seamlessly into the arsenal's supply. Nobody kept track of where one pile ended and another began. The war didn't care for origins. It cared for endurance. And yet, somewhere deep in that rolling mass of iron, a trace of Sam Mallister remained, a fingerprint on a bolt, a molecule of carbon from the windmill that once turned under the Kansas sky. That was enough. Back in Marshall County, the nights grew long. Sam sat by the stove, the orange glow flickering against the walls. Outside, snow whispered against the window panes. He leaned back, listening to the crackle of wood and the faraway whistle of a freight train cutting through the dark. He smiled, faint and knowing. The world was moving forward. His part was done. But his steel, was still on the move. And soon it would meet its destiny. June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. The world had turned to fire. The sea frothed with machines and men. Waves slammed into steel ramps. Engines screamed. The smell of salt, oil, and cordite filled the air. From the grey surf rose the first American tanks, steel beasts born from the furnaces of Detroit, rolling into hell beneath a sky split by gunfire. Among them was Sherman M4, serial number 21694, stenciled with a single name in white paint: Liberty Rose. Second Lieutenant Robert Hastings, age 23, gripped the hatch rim as the tank dropped from the landing craft into the surf. He wasn't thinking of Kansas or Detroit or the nameless men who had built the armor beneath him. He was thinking of survival. Machine gun tracers clawed at the water. The beach erupted in explosions. Tanks sank. Men vanished. But Liberty Rose kept crawling forward, tracks grinding over sand and shrapnel, water slamming against her sides. Her armor shuddered under impact after impact, but she didn't break. By noon, Hastings' crew had clawed past the seawall. The turret smoked. The radio cracked. Somewhere behind that metal hide, a farm's worth of scrap bed frames, fence posts, windmill blades held together under fire. No one inside knew that a Kansas farmer's stubborn heart was welded into every plate. 4 days later, near a hedgerow outside Isigny-sur-Mer, Liberty Rose rolled through a narrow French lane bordered by thick green walls. The sky was low, heavy with smoke. Hastings led a column of tanks toward open ground when the ambush came. A German panzer fired from concealed cover. The shell hit dead center 500 yards, point blank. The impact threw Hastings against the turret ring. Flames burst beneath the hull. Inside, the crew shouted, choking on smoke. He braced for the second blast that never came. The shell hadn't pierced. It had cracked the steel, but it held, barely. They scrambled out, coughing, alive. 30 minutes later, infantry reached them. The tank burned behind, the armor glowing red but unbroken. Hastings looked back and said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Something saved us. That front plate should have folded. I don't know what kind of steel that was, but it was damn good steel." He didn't know that part of that armor had once been a windmill turning slow circles above a Kansas field. He didn't know that its frame had survived lightning, fire, and rust before ever meeting war. But the truth is, the metal had already been tested by storms long before it met the battlefield. In Detroit, they called it the miracle batch steel that resisted fracture beyond specification. Engineers credited chemistry, temperature, maybe luck. They didn't know it had come from Marshall County, Kansas. They didn't know a farmer named Samuel Mallister had dragged that same metal from the mud with his bare hands 9 months earlier. But history has its own quiet arithmetic. Rust plus resolve equals survival. By 1944, the War Production Board estimated that 40% of the steel in American tanks came from recycled scrap. That meant nearly half of every tank that rolled through Normandy carried within it pieces of ordinary life: cooking pots, mailboxes, tractors, water pumps, the everyday bones of a nation that refused to quit. The enemy had mocked that once. Berlin radio had sneered, "The Americans think they can defeat the Reich with curtain rods and bed frames." They weren't laughing anymore. Back in Kansas, Sam Mallister never heard those broadcasts. He was in his fields, hands in the soil, harvesting wheat under a pale sky. The barn had a new roof now. The land was quiet except for the rattle of wind through dry stalks. He didn't know that somewhere in France, a young soldier had survived because of his scrap. He didn't know that his iron bed frame, melted and reforged, had turned aside death itself. But maybe he didn't need to know. For Sam, meaning had never come from recognition, it came from the act itself. From doing what was right when no one was watching. When the mail train passed each evening, he would pause his work, hat in hand, and listen to the whistle fade. In that sound, he heard connection: farm to furnace, furnace to battlefield, man to man. He had done his part. The rest was in God's hands. The war ended the way all storms end, suddenly and with silence. The 2nd of September 1945. Japan surrendered aboard the USS Missouri. The guns fell quiet. The world exhaled. Factories turned back to cars and tractors. Scrap drives ended. The certificates came: official thanks from the War Production Board, printed on cream paper with black ink. Sam received one that winter. It read, "In recognition of your extraordinary contribution to America's war effort through the National Salvage Program." He framed it and hung it in the parlor beside the family Bible. Martha smiled when she saw it. "You finally got your proof," she said. Sam just nodded. Proof's been in the steel all along. Years passed. David Mallister grew up, studied engineering, and took a job in Michigan, designing new machinery for post-war farms, tractors built with leftover tank parts. War steel turned to harvest, he called it. He never forgot what his father had done. And though Sam never bragged, the story began to spread through the town, the county, the state. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day, a retired tank commander named Robert Hastings appeared on national television. His hair was white now, his voice gravelly but firm. He spoke about Normandy, about the ambush, about the shell that hit but didn't kill. Then, unprompted, he said, "I don't know who gave the steel for that tank, but if you're out there, if you're watching, I owe you my life." That night in Marshall County, David Mallister watched the broadcast with his children. He didn't cry, but he paused the tape, rewound it, and played that line again. Then he said quietly, "Your great-grandfather might have been that man." Outside, the prairie wind blew steady, carrying the scent of wheat and rust, the same air Sam had breathed half a century earlier. In the fading glow of the television, the circle was complete. A piece of forgotten iron had traveled from a broken windmill to a furnace to a battlefield, and back again, a testament forged not in glory, but in grit. When historians write about war, they speak of battles, generals, and grand strategies. But the truth of victory lies elsewhere, in the barns, the kitchens, the junkyards. In the quiet conviction of people like Sam Mallister, who believed that even rust could matter. He never fired a gun. He never set foot on a battlefield. But when a tank deflected a shell in a hedgerow in France, his faith was there, hardened into steel, invisible yet indestructible. That's the story history often forgets. The strength of a free people fed by belief, each small act joining another until the sum becomes unstoppable. And maybe that's what America was in 1942, not a country of heroes, but a nation of hands. Hands that built, carried, forged, and gave. Hands that turned rust into resilience. When the camera fades to black, picture this: a Kansas farm at dusk, a field swept by wind, an old man on a porch, eyes closed, listening to a distant train. It's not heaven he's hearing. its history still moving, still alive, carried forward by the weight of ordinary men who believed that even the smallest scrap of effort could change the world.